Before we dive in, picture this. A retired black aviation pioneer is quietly asked to give up her seat in first class, not because of a mistake, but because she doesn't look like she belongs there. What happens next? Well, it didn't just shake up a flight, it grounded an entire airline. You won't believe who she really is, and what she does next will leave you speechless. The morning air had that familiar Georgia warmth to it, soft and sticky around the edges, even though the sun hadn't quite made up its mind to shine. Marva Ellington sat by the kitchen window of her modest home in Stonewood, a quiet suburb not far from Atlanta. The tea kettle hissed gently on the stove, steam curling up like a whisper. She stirred her tea with slow, practiced motions, the way she always had, clockwise then once counter. The house was quiet now, too quiet sometimes. Her late husband, Leo, had passed 10 years back. The kids were grown, grandkids scattered across states, but today she had somewhere to be, San Francisco. Her granddaughter's 10th birthday was coming up, and Marva wouldn't miss it for the world. That little girl was the only one who still asked about the old photos in the hallway. The ones with Marva standing at podiums, sitting across from white men in suits, pointing at charts twice her size. She used to be someone in the airline world. Not that it mattered now. She checked the time, then the boarding pass again. First class. Seat 1A. The same seat she always booked when she had to fly long haul. Not for vanity. Lord knew she didn't care who was sipping champagne. But for her knees. Arthritis had a way of reminding her she was no longer 42. That seat, right by the window, with a little more leg room, let her stretch without apology. She reached into her worn leather bag to make sure she had everything. ID, wallet, her Legacy Elite card from Aureus Skylines, a relic from her consulting days, but still valid. She'd earned it fair and square, and it still came in handy, at least on paper. Before heading to the airport, Marva made a stop at her usual cafe, Maple and Fern. It was a cozy corner spot tucked between a laundromat and a florist. The barista, a young man named Benny, spotted her the moment she walked in. "Well, if it isn't Miss M," he smiled, handing her the usual without asking. Black tea, 1 sugar, and a cranberry muffin split in half. "You spoil me, Benny," he chuckled. "You deserve it. You still helping random folks with their taxes in the spring?" "Only the ones who ask nice," she winked, tucking a 5 into the tip jar. The airport was its usual blur of announcements, hurried footsteps, and rolling suitcases. At the check-in counter, Marva slid her ID and Elite card across the desk. The young woman on the other side barely glanced up before printing the tag. "First class, seat 1A, she mumbled, her voice polite but clipped. Marva noticed the pause, the faint lift of an eyebrow. She said nothing. She'd learned over decades of traveling which battles were worth picking. Security was slow, but uneventful. She helped an older man, must have been in his 80s, wrestle his coat off at the metal detector, then waited patiently while he thanked her twice. "You remind me of my sister," he said, voice shaking a little. "I'll take that as a compliment," Marva smiled, walking him to his gate before heading to hers. By the time she reached gate B12, boarding had already started for Group 1, her group. She walked slowly but steadily, hand brushing the strap of her carry-on. A few people glanced up as she passed. Some looked right through her. She didn't mind. When she stepped onto the aircraft, the cabin greeted her with that signature first-class hum. Plush seats, dimmed lighting, the quiet clink of glasses being placed just so. A young flight attendant smiled politely as Marva made her way to the front. "Welcome aboard, ma'am." Marva nodded, made her way to 1A, and carefully slid her bag into the overhead bin. She lowered herself into the seat, adjusting the back cushion and gently extending her legs with a quiet sigh. That was better. She pulled a book from her purse, one she'd read before, and opened it just as a shadow moved across her peripheral vision. She glanced up, and that was when she saw her. A woman, tall, mid-50s, sleek platinum hair pulled into a tight bun, tailored blazer, heels that clicked with intention, stood just beyond the first-class curtain, her gaze locked on Marva's seat. She had the kind of posture that told the world she belonged, no matter where she stood. She didn't say anything, not yet, but her eyes did. Marva turned back to her book, willing herself not to assume, not to guess, not to jump. But something in the air had shifted, the kind of stillness right before a storm. And deep down, in a place she didn't like to visit too often, Marva already knew. It wasn't going to be just another flight. Not this time. The woman didn't speak right away. She just stood there, like she expected Marva to move out of instinct. Her arms folded tightly across her chest, lips pursed, eyes darting toward the nearest flight attendant, like she'd just spotted a spill that needed cleaning. Marva could feel her presence long before the words came. She turned a page in her book, not because she was reading, but because it helped keep her hand steady. Finally, the woman let out a breath that sounded more like a statement than a sigh. "There seems to be a mistake," she said loudly, directing her voice more to the cabin crew than to Marva. "This seat is usually mine." Marva looked up slowly, the corners of her mouth lifting just enough to be polite. "I don't believe seats belong to anyone," she said gently, "but this one was assigned to me." Before the woman could respond, a flight attendant approached. Short blonde hair, neatly styled, clipboard in hand. Her name tag read Tessa. Her smile was tight, too tight to be kind. "Good afternoon," Tessa said, but her tone had none of the warmth that the words were supposed to carry. "Ma'am, we may have a little mix-up here. This seat is typically reserved for one of our frequent priority guests." She gestured vaguely toward the standing woman, who was now tapping a gold bracelet against her forearm. "This is seat 1A, correct?" Marva asked, pulling her boarding pass from her purse. "That's what's printed right here, and I am a Legacy Elite member." She handed the card over. Tessa glanced at it, her eyes scanning quickly, then darting back to the woman still standing. The brief pause said everything Marva needed to know. This wasn't about a mistake. It was about comfort, preference, and appearance. "I see that, ma'am," Tessa said, handing the card back. "But Ms. Whitbridge here is a valued guest who flies this route regularly and is accustomed to seat 1A. I'm Ms. Whitbridge." Of course, even the name sounded expensive. Marva didn't flinch. She'd been in boardrooms where men called her honey and girl before asking her to fix their entire financial models. She had no reason to move, no reason except their discomfort. "With all due respect," Marva said, voice steady, "I booked this ticket months ago. I selected this seat specifically. I have joint issues. I need the legroom." From across the cabin, someone shifted in their seat. A man pulled out his phone and angled it just slightly toward the scene. Marva saw it in her periphery and wondered if he'd hit record yet. Sloane Whitbridge's tone sharpened. "I've flown this exact flight every other week for the last 4 years," she said. "I always sit here. It's practically mine." Tessa tried again, this time with forced sympathy. "Perhaps we could offer you a different seat in our premium section, just a few rows back. It's still very comfortable, and we'd be happy to provide a complimentary beverage or—" "No," Marva said, her voice low but firm. "I'll be staying right here." Tessa's polite mask cracked just a little. She gave a brief nod and turned on her heel, disappearing behind the curtain toward the front galley. Marva exhaled, but only slightly. Ms. Whitbridge, however, remained exactly where she was, still standing over Marva, arms crossed tightly. Her tone now carried a bit more heat. "I have a meeting in San Francisco as soon as we land," she said, loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear. "This is the worst customer service I've ever experienced." From somewhere a few seats back, a woman in a navy blazer whispered to the man beside her, "What's the big deal?" "It's just a seat." He didn't respond, but his phone screen lit up, camera icon visible. A minute later, a tall man in a neatly pressed uniform arrived. Grant Vessler, the onboard cabin supervisor. His expression was a blend of politeness and practiced authority. "Ma'am," he said to Marva, "I understand there's a situation. Would you be willing to accommodate one of our VIP travelers by relocating?" Marva didn't move. "I'm in my assigned seat." Grant's jaw tightened. "We sometimes make exceptions for our top-tier passengers. It's about providing comfort for those who don't look like me," Marva asked, her eyes locking onto his. "Is that what this is?" A low hum spread through the cabin as passengers began to murmur. One woman's phone was now clearly recording. "That's not what I said, ma'am," Grant replied quickly, his smile slipping. "I'm simply asking if you're willing to help us resolve this quietly." Marva held her gaze, then leaned back into the seat as if anchoring herself to it. I paid for this seat. I chose this seat. I'm staying in this seat. Grant's face flushed, not from heat, but from something else. Something he wasn't used to encountering in first class. Resistance. Dignified, unapologetic resistance. Without another word, he turned and walked briskly to the front of the cabin. Marva looked down at her book again, though the words were still swimming too much to read. From her right, she heard the unmistakable sound of cash, folded bills being passed from one hand to another. She turned her head just slightly enough to catch the moment Sloane slipped a neat wad into Tessa's hand as she passed. Thanks for helping sort this out, Sloane whispered, her tone sweet but sharp. Tessa didn't say a word. She just pocketed the cash and kept walking. Marva didn't react. She didn't need to. She knew the cameras were still rolling, and somewhere deep in her bones she felt it. This was no longer about a seat. It hadn't been for a while. The quiet inside the first-class cabin didn't last. Whispers floated like dust particles in sunlight, small but impossible to ignore. Marva could feel them circling her, the way cold air wraps around your back when a door opens behind you. Grant returned a few minutes later, walking with stiffer shoulders, jaw locked tight. This time, he wasn't alone. A second flight attendant trailed him, Isla Rayner. Younger, with a nervous energy that couldn't quite be masked by her perfectly applied lipstick. Her hands fidgeted at her waist, tugging at the edge of her uniform jacket. Grant leaned in toward Marva's row, speaking lower this time, but not low enough to miss the authority in his tone. Ma'am, I'll ask again, he said, eyes fixed on hers. Will you kindly relocate so that we can proceed with boarding? Marva didn't blink. She didn't reach for her bag. Her voice came out slow and even, just above a whisper. I'm not moving. This is the seat I paid for. This is the seat I was assigned. I've done nothing wrong. Grant's smile thinned, his patience stretching toward a breaking point. You're escalating a situation that doesn't need to become a scene. Marva turned her head just slightly, letting her eyes meet his. I'm not the one standing here making a scene, she replied. A few rows back, Isla stood silently by the galley curtain, gripping her tablet so tightly her knuckles were pale. Her eyes darted between Marva, Grant, and Tessa, who now lingered nearby, sipping from a water bottle like nothing at all was unfolding. Then came the unmistakable sound of a phone being unmuted, a soft chime as a passenger hit record. And another, then another. It was no longer subtle. Half the first-class cabin had eyes and lenses on the moment. Grant's voice dropped even lower. We can do this the easy way, ma'am, or the hard way. The words landed not as a threat, but as a line rehearsed too many times, like he'd said it before, and it had always worked, but not this time. Marva didn't flinch. She simply raised an eyebrow and said, Is that what you say when a white man's in this seat too? The question sat between them, heavy and still. Grant said nothing. His nostrils flared. His lips parted like he was about to speak, but then closed again. Isla finally stepped forward, clearing her throat quietly. She didn't speak, not at first, but her presence alone shifted the air. She looked down at the tablet in her hand, then back up at Grant. I double-checked, she said, her voice just above a whisper. She is an elite legacy member. Her seat is confirmed. Grant didn't thank her. He didn't even look at her. Instead, he pivoted and disappeared again toward the front cabin. But his departure didn't dissolve the tension. It only thickened it. Sloane was still standing off to the side, her designer tote slung casually over one arm. She leaned toward Marva's seat and gave a forced chuckle. People really do get territorial over things these days, she muttered. Marva gave her a look, not angry, not sharp, just calm. The kind of look that's seen too much to waste on argument. You're standing over me, ma'am, she said. That's what territorial looks like. Isla's fingers trembled as she tapped the screen of her tablet, but this time, it wasn't for passenger information. It was to open her phone's camera app. She held the phone low, at waist level, angling it toward Marva and Sloane. She didn't speak. She didn't interfere. She just documented, because something in her gut said this was more than policy, and she wasn't sure anymore if she wanted to be on the wrong side of it. Minutes passed. The cabin filled. Passengers buckled their seatbelts. Some stole glances at the front row, pretending to scroll their phones while keeping one eye on the woman who wouldn't budge, and the one who expected the world to move around her. Then Sloane made a move. With practiced grace, she reached into her purse, pulled out a crisp folded bill, and as Tessa passed by again, slipped it into the attendant's palm, like she was tipping at a restaurant. "Appreciate the help," Sloane said in a tone that could have been mistaken for a compliment, if not for the thin veil of entitlement clinging to every word. Marva saw it. Isla saw it. And at least two passengers caught it on camera. When Tessa realized the eyes were on her face flushed. She gave a stiff smile and walked off quickly, heading toward the cockpit. Marva turned her eyes out the window, watching the ground crew moving around beneath the plane. A part of her wished she could stay invisible. Just fly, land, hug her granddaughter, and be done with it. But another part of her, the part that had once stood in front of rooms full of doubters and delivered numbers they swore she couldn't understand. That part, it was wide awake now. There was a reason she had chosen seat 1A. And it wasn't just the legroom. It was because she'd earned it. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't going to let anyone take that away. The engines hadn't even started, but the air inside the cabin was already burning. Not from heat, but from friction. The kind that happens when two worlds rub against each other and realize they were never meant to share the same space. Not peacefully, anyway. Marva didn't look up when she heard the cockpit door open. She didn't need to. The shift in energy was enough. The shuffle of shoes with more purpose. The low murmurs of crew members trying not to look like they were bracing for something. Captain Roderick Hayes stepped out. Late 50s, tall, trim, with a face that looked carved from stone and a walk that announced rank. He wasn't new, and he wasn't happy. Grant followed behind him, flanked by Tessa, who now avoided eye contact with every passenger she passed. Isla was nowhere to be seen, maybe sent to the back, maybe choosing not to stand too close. The captain stopped in front of Marva, lips pressed into a professional line. He cleared his throat, then spoke with the sort of voice people reserve for handling sharp objects or bad news. "Ma'am, I understand there's been a seating issue. Our team has the discretion to reassign seats when necessary to maintain passenger comfort." Marva looked up from her hands resting quietly in her lap. She offered a small nod, not of agreement, but acknowledgement. "Yes, I've heard that line 3 times now." A flicker of something crossed the captain's face. Whether it was annoyance or regret, it was hard to tell. "This isn't personal," he added. "It's procedural. Sometimes these things happen, and we have to adapt." "Funny," Marva said quietly. Procedure didn't seem to apply when she tilted her head ever so slightly toward Sloane. "Slipped your attendant cash." Gasps rippled down the aisle. Sloane, seated now in the opposite corner of first class with her arms tightly crossed, shifted uncomfortably. Her eyes darted toward Tessa, then back to her phone. She tapped the screen like it might save her from the moment. Grant stepped forward, his voice sharper now. "If you continue to be uncooperative, we'll have no choice but to remove you from the aircraft." That word, remove, hung in the air like smoke. Thick, bitter, impossible to ignore. Marva tilted her head. "For sitting in my assigned seat?" Grant didn't answer. The captain didn't either. That silence? That was the real problem. That was the sound people made when they realized the truth was louder than their justifications. Someone a few rows back whispered, "She's right." Another voice muttered, "This is messed up." A phone camera angled higher. Marva reached down, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out her phone. "If you're going to remove me," she said, her voice calm but crystal clear, "I'd like to record the reason why." Grant's face tensed. He stepped forward, hand out like he might grab it. "You can't film on the plane without permission." Marva didn't flinch. Her thumb hovered just above the record button. "There's no federal regulation against recording unless I'm interfering with safety or crew operations. I'm sitting quietly in my seat, sir." His hand stopped midair. His jaw clenched. And then, like a cue in a play, the 2 uniformed security officers arrived. They weren't part of the crew. They were airport officers, summoned by someone on board. Their presence sent a new current of tension through the cabin. People fell completely silent. You could hear the soft click of belts tightening. A baby 2 rows back stopped fussing, like even it sensed something wasn't right. The taller officer spoke first. "Ma'am, we've been called to assist with a removal request." Marva looked up at him calmly. "Then please explain what policy I violated." The officer hesitated. His partner glanced down at a tablet, brows furrowing as he scanned the report. "It says here you refused a crew directive to change seats." "And what was the reason given for the directive?" she asked, still seated, still calm. No answer. She turned her attention back to the captain. "Sir, am I being removed because I broke a rule? Or because I refused to surrender my place to someone who thinks they deserve it more than me?" Captain Hayes shifted slightly, straightened his shoulders, then replied, "You're being removed for causing a disturbance." A murmur rippled again through the cabin. One man sat forward in his seat. A woman covered her mouth. Another raised her phone a little higher. Marva reached down, unbuckled her belt, and stood. Her movements were slow, graceful, the kind of quiet dignity you can't fake. She gathered her purse, her scarf, the book she never really got to start, and then she looked up, eyes not angry, not defeated, but tired in the way only people who've fought the same battle over and over can be. "This is what a disturbance looks like now," she said, not to the crew but to the room, and she turned to walk out. As she passed Sloan, something happened. Sloan leaned over slightly, barely enough to be seen, but just enough for the nearest phone camera to catch it. She whispered, "About time they took care of this." The flash of entitlement on her face burned brighter than any overhead light. The officers didn't rush Marva. They didn't touch her. They didn't need to. She walked with a spine straighter than any protocol could allow. Back in the cabin, no one said a word. But the silence wasn't for comfort. It was for shame. The fluorescent lights of Terminal C flickered slightly overhead, casting a dull glare on the polished tile floor. Marva sat quietly near Gate 47, not far from where they'd escorted her off Flight 2839. Her scarf was folded neatly across her lap, hands resting on top of it like she were holding something sacred. She wasn't crying. She hadn't cried in years. But something in her chest ached in that quiet, hollow way, a feeling more familiar than she'd like to admit. People passed by without recognizing her. Just another older black woman waiting for a flight. No one saw the storm she had just walked out of. No one knew she had once helped write the very passenger protocols being used. Bent, twisted, erased, against her now. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. 2 notifications blinked at her. One was from her granddaughter, a photo of a half-decorated birthday cake with messy blue icing that read, "See you soon, Nana." The other was from her attorney. Marva opened her messages, not to respond, but to type something for herself. She needed to get the words down while they were still fresh, before the weight of what had happened settled in too deeply to lift. "I've been removed from a flight, not for a security threat, not for refusing to comply with safety protocol. I was removed for sitting in a seat that belonged to me, simply because someone else, with the right skin tone and the right connections, wanted it." She stared at the words. Her thumb hovered over the send button. Then she hesitated. Did she want to be the center of this storm? She was retired. She had her savings. Her days of fighting uphill battles in boardrooms were over. Supposed to be anyway. But something kept circling back in her mind. That little girl in the airport last year. The one who stopped her and said, "My mom said you helped change the way women fly." Is that true? At the time, Marva had smiled and said something vague. Now she wished she'd said more. She hit record and began speaking, softly but clearly. "This is Marva Ellington. I'm standing in the Atlanta airport. I was removed from my assigned seat in first class by airline staff after refusing to give it up for a white woman. I showed them my boarding pass, my elite status, everything. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't disobey any rules. I just didn't give up my seat." She paused, a deep breath. "And if that's what qualifies as a threat now, then something is very wrong. I've spent my whole life believing that if you worked hard, stayed polite, followed the rules, you'd be treated with dignity. Today I learned those rules only apply to some of us." She hit stop. Not even 30 seconds. but it felt like she had poured an entire lifetime into it. She texted the file to Samantha Brown, her former COO at Ellington Strategies, now a trusted friend and still her emergency contact for things like this. The message was simple. I think it's time we reminded them who they removed. Minutes later, her phone buzzed. A new message from Samantha. Already assembling the team. Sit tight. You're not alone. Just then, a shadow appeared in front of her. It wasn't a security guard or a staff member. It was a young woman, maybe mid-30s, with tight curls pulled back into a bun and a phone clutched tightly in her hand. Excuse me, the woman said softly. You don't know me, but I was in 3C. I recorded everything. Marva blinked. The woman continued, her voice shaking slightly. I didn't know what to say, but I couldn't just let that happen. Not without someone knowing what they did. She held up her phone showing a crystal clear video that began just as Tessa approached with that too-practiced smile and ended with Sloane slipping the folded bill into her pocket. The clarity was stunning. Every word, every movement, even the expression on Grant's face when he realized the cameras were rolling. I'll send it to you, the woman said. Use it however you need, and if this ever goes legal, I'll testify. Marva exhaled, a breath she hadn't even realized she'd been holding. Thank you, she whispered. The woman gave a shaky smile and turned to go, but Marva stopped her. What's your name? Isla, she said. Isla Rayner. Marva nodded. I'll remember that. As Isla disappeared into the crowd, Marva sat back, phone resting in her lap. She had always believed in quiet power, the kind that didn't need shouting, the kind that came with facts, proof, and a spine made of steel. Today, that quiet power had been underestimated, and now it was just getting started. Back on board, Flight 2839, things had returned to what most would call normal. Passengers were seated, luggage stowed, cabin lights dimmed to that soft, sleep-suggestive glow. Champagne glasses clinked gently, and pre-flight announcements buzzed through the overhead speakers. But no one was really listening. There was a weight in the air, something that hung between the rows like a question left unanswered. A few first-class passengers kept glancing towards seat 1A, which now sat empty, the seatbelt neatly folded, the armrest untouched. Sloane sat across the aisle, finally settled into her preferred seat. Her phone was out, scrolling through emails, though her eyes didn't seem to be focused on anything. Her fingers moved nervously, tapping the screen without purpose. She'd gotten what she wanted, the seat, the space, the comfort. And yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, and not in her favor. Tessa passed by again, pausing with a cloth napkin and a glass of lemon water. Everything all right, Miss Whitbridge? She asked quietly. Sloane looked up. Fine, she said, then added, let's just get going. But the crew wasn't moving quickly anymore. The captain was still in the cockpit, and Grant stood near the galley, speaking in hushed tones to someone on his phone. His voice was clipped, annoyed, laced with a kind of confusion he didn't enjoy feeling. I told her it was policy, he whispered sharply. She wasn't even raising her voice. He paused, listening. No, I didn't touch her, but she filmed it. She knew her rights. Another pause. Yeah, we're taking off now. I'll file the report after landing. He hung up and turned toward the front, but his shoulders, usually squared and composed, now slumped slightly, like the weight of the moment had finally begun pressing into his spine. Tessa met his eyes for just a second. They didn't speak. They didn't have to, because deep down they both knew they had crossed a line. And it wasn't just about who sat where. It was about who was allowed to take up space without having to explain themselves. Back in the rear galley, Isla leaned against the wall, arms crossed tightly across her chest. She wasn't supposed to have her phone out during takeoff, but she didn't care. She kept replaying the footage she'd received from the passenger outside, the full video of the incident. She'd watched it 3 times now. Every time the same details hit harder. Marva's calm voice, Grant's veiled threats, Sloane's cash exchange, and the silence of everyone else. Isla closed her eyes. Her stomach turned. She hadn't said anything. Not when it counted. She hadn't stood between Marva and the door. She hadn't spoken up in that moment, even when she'd known it was wrong. All she'd done was film, and now the video was out of her hands. She could already feel the shift. Her phone buzzed with a message from a fellow flight attendant, someone who'd seen the footage on a social media page called The Beacon. "Is this real? Tell me this isn't you guys." She didn't reply. The worst part wasn't being seen. It was being silent when she should have said something. Back in first class, Sloan looked up and noticed the red recording light from a camera across the aisle was still blinking. The man behind it didn't hide it anymore. He wasn't being subtle. He caught her eyes, then smiled. Not warm, not friendly, just knowing. She turned back toward the window, but there was nothing to see except her own reflection. She tried to smooth her hair, tried to sit taller, but in the reflection, she didn't look powerful. She looked exposed. As the plane began its taxi, the captain came on over the intercom. His voice sounded exactly as it always had, measured, practiced, detached. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be departing shortly. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened, and thank you for choosing Aurea Skylines." The words fell flat, because now everyone on board knew exactly what kind of choice they'd made. And for some, like Tessa, Grant, and Sloan, that choice was going to cost them a lot more than just a delay. Somewhere at 30,000 feet, the real descent had already begun. By the time Flight 2839 landed in San Francisco, the outside world was already miles ahead of the aircraft. The moment Marva stepped off that plane, she'd set off something far bigger than anyone on board realized. Something that had been waiting, quietly, patiently, for someone to strike the match. It started small, as it often does. A blurry repost of the video showed up on a mid-sized social media account that specialized in customer service horror stories. No names, no hashtags, just a caption. "Black woman removed from first-class seat despite valid ticket. Passenger who took her seat slipped cash to flight crew." Still think this isn't about race? At first, it was just a few hundred views. Then someone recognized Marva. Not from the flight, from history. A retired executive from a national aviation consultancy shared the clip, adding context. "That woman is Marva Ellington, one of the first black women to hold a senior advisory role in commercial aviation. If they'll do this to her, imagine what they're doing to people without her resume." That post exploded. By the time the plane touched down, the video had already hit 60,000 views. Within the hour, 500,000. Local news stations picked it up. Then national outlets. Then celebrity accounts with millions of followers added their voices. Back in the terminal, Sloan tried to exit quickly. Sunglasses already pulled down over her face. She kept her head low, hoping to blend in. But someone near baggage claim muttered loud enough for her to hear, "Isn't that her?" She walked faster. The airport suddenly felt smaller, like the walls were listening. Grant, meanwhile, took a different approach. He stood near the crew exit, arms crossed, waiting for the captain to finish post-flight reports. His posture was confident, almost defiant, but his eyes kept flicking toward his phone, watching the view count rise. When Tessa joined him, she didn't speak right away. Her hands were shaking, barely able to grip her ID badge. She finally whispered, "They have the footage." Grant didn't respond, because what was there to say? They'd both been part of it, not by mistake, but by habit. They hadn't questioned Sloan's entitlement. They hadn't questioned their own choices. They hadn't paused to ask if their comfort with the process meant others were suffering from it. And now the whole country was watching. Inside a private lounge at the airport, Marva sat across from Samantha Brown, her former COO. Samantha had flown in from Chicago the moment she saw the footage online. No phone call, no scheduling. Just booked the ticket and came. The two women didn't hug. They didn't need to. They'd been through battles together before. Marva handed her a USB drive. "This is the original recording," she said. "Multiple passengers sent their versions, but this one's the cleanest." Samantha plugged it into her laptop. Her expression changed with every second that passed, her jaw tightening, her fingers clenching the armrest. When it ended, she looked up. "We go public," she said. "Not just a statement. We go loud." Marva shook her head slightly. "We don't scream. We show." Samantha leaned back, understanding. Like always. Across the country, airline executives at Aurea Skylines were scrambling. By noon, the CEO's inbox had over 400 emails flagged urgent. Shareholders were calling. Journalists were camped outside their headquarters in Denver. Board members were texting one another in group chats filled with phrases like, contain the fallout, legal exposure, and find out who she is. They didn't know yet. They still hadn't connected the woman in seat 1A with the Marva Ellington on their investor registry. That wouldn't last long, because Marva had made one more call that morning. Not to a lawyer, not to the press. She called a former student of hers, a tech entrepreneur now running a media company. I want people to know what happened, she told him. But more than that, I want them to understand why it matters. He didn't ask follow-up questions. He just replied, say less. We're on it. By sunset, the headline hit national TV. Aviation pioneer removed from flight over seat dispute. Airline faces accusations of racial bias and bribery. And underneath that, the subheader, Marva Ellington, executive, advocate, and shareholder, issues statement, you cannot train bias out of a culture you refuse to acknowledge. The unraveling had begun, and for the first time in a long while, Marva wasn't the one being told to move. She was the one making others take a hard look at where they were sitting. Night fell heavy over San Francisco, but sleep didn't come easy to anyone with ties to Aureus skylines. Inside their downtown headquarters, the lights stayed on long past closing. Conference rooms once used for sales strategy and route expansions were now filled with legal teams, PR reps, and executives whispering with the panic of people who just discovered their foundation was cracked and visible to the entire world. On a whiteboard in the largest boardroom, someone had scribbled 2 words in red dry erase marker, contain damage. But damage doesn't like to be contained, especially when it's not just about one seat, one flight, or one woman. It was about everything that had been allowed to happen under the banner of protocol. CEO Raymond Holt sat at the head of the table, jaw clenched, staring at the muted television screen as news anchors dissected the incident from every angle. The footage now had over 5 million views and had made it into 3 morning shows, each asking the same question. How does a woman with that resume get removed from her seat without anyone stopping it? And worse, how many more haven't we heard about? A knock at the door broke the silence. One of his assistants peeked in. Sir, you should see this. Raymond took the tablet she handed him. At first, he didn't recognize the document, but then his eyes widened. It was an internal shareholder register, one he'd seen a dozen times before, never reading too closely, and there it was. M. Ellington, strategic investor, 3.6% ownership. He looked up. This is her? The assistant nodded. And that's just her portion, she added. Her consulting group manages over 25% when combined with partner entities. Technically, she's your largest stakeholder. Raymond sat back. Cold spread through his chest. It wasn't just bad optics anymore. This was a corporate earthquake. Across town in a quiet hotel suite overlooking the Bay Bridge, Marva stood by the window. She wasn't admiring the view. She was thinking, calculating, listening to the sound of cars far below and the occasional seagull cutting across the dark. Behind her, Samantha paced with a phone to her ear. Yes, we're requesting a shareholder emergency meeting, she said firmly. Per Clause 6C of the Governance Charter. Yes, I've read it. She turned to Marva, mouthing, they're scrambling. Marva nodded once slowly. She already knew. On the table, spread out like a blueprint for something bigger, were notes, diagrams, and a freshly printed proposal. Not for revenge, not for show, for reform. We're not just calling for heads, Marva said, her voice calm. We're calling for roots. Samantha stopped pacing. You sure you want to go this far? Marva turned from the window. Her eyes were tired but unshakable. They used to tell me to stay in my lane, but now I own the road. Back at the airport, the ripple effects continued. Isla Rayner sat alone in a staff break room, her uniform jacket folded beside her, a microwaved coffee cooling on the counter. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through her inbox. Messages from fellow crew members, friends, strangers. Some thanked her, some blamed her, and some asked the hardest question, why didn't you speak up sooner? She kept hearing Marva's voice in her head, not during the argument, but after, in the hallway, when Isla had quietly followed at a distance. Marva had looked over her shoulder and said gently, without judgment, "You saw it, didn't you?" Isla had nodded. Marva only said one more thing before walking away. "Then do something with that." That sentence had pressed itself into Isla's chest like a bruise that wouldn't fade. Now she pulled open her notes app and began typing. Flight attendants are trained to put safety first. But what about dignity? What about fairness? I watched a woman be removed from her rightful seat because someone else was used to getting what they wanted. And we all just let it happen. She hit send. And with that, her internal memo, raw, honest, imperfect, joined the growing storm outside. One by one, the quiet corners were disappearing. People who had kept their heads down were now lifting their eyes. Not because they'd suddenly grown brave, but because someone else had stood up when it mattered most. Marva didn't ask for any of this. But now that it had begun, she wasn't backing down. Not when the seat was never the issue. Not when the system was the one that needed grounding. By morning, Aurea Skylines was a company caught in freefall, and the public was watching every inch of the descent. Cable news ran the footage on repeat. Talk shows brought on experts, former airline staff, diversity consultants, and then came the late-night comedians slicing into the scandal with biting ease. It wasn't just bad PR anymore. It was cultural shorthand. You don't want to get one aid, one comedian quipped, to a roar of audience laughter. That's when you pay for a seat but don't pass the vibe check. But inside Marva's world, there was no laughter, only focus. She sat in a leather chair inside a modest conference room at a co-working space near Union Square. Her team was assembled around her, Samantha, two lawyers, and Devin Marks, the media strategist she'd once mentored, now the man coordinating the message behind the movement. A screen on the wall streamed live analytics. The numbers told a story louder than any press release. 6 million views, 92% positive sentiment, and over 140,000 uses of the hashtag #seat1. Samantha sipped her coffee, eyes never leaving her laptop. The board's convening in 36 hours, she said. They're trying to stay ahead of the vote. You'll be invited to join virtually, or if you want to make a statement. I'll be there in person, Marva said, her voice even. I want them to see my face. No one questioned her. Devin glanced at his phone, then looked up. You ready for the interview? They'll broadcast it tonight. Prime time. Marva nodded once. Let's give the public more than just outrage. The interview was set up at a quiet studio on the north side of the city. No flashing lights, no makeup team. Just Marva in a simple blazer, a gold brooch on her lapel that used to belong to her mother, and a quiet strength that filled the room. The journalist began gently. Ms. Ellington, you've said this isn't just about a seat. What is it about for you? Marva didn't hesitate. It's about assumptions, about who belongs, about how the systems we trust to be fair still depend on individual discretion, and too often, that discretion is biased. The clip went viral before the segment even ended. Back at Aurea's HQ in Denver, CEO Raymond Holt watched the broadcast from a dark corner of the executive floor. He didn't speak, didn't blink much either. When the camera cut to commercial, he muttered, "She's not going away." "No, sir," his assistant replied softly. "She's moving in." What no one outside the room knew yet, what only a few people in the entire company were beginning to understand, was that Marva wasn't just planning to clean up the mess. She was planning to rewire the whole machine, and she wasn't alone. That same morning, flight crews across the country began submitting internal petitions, letters signed by hundreds of employees. One line stood out in them all: "We no longer want to work in silence." In one break room in Nashville, an attendant pinned a copy of Marva's interview transcript to the bulletin board. In another in Detroit, someone printed out a screenshot of the moment Sloan handed Tessa the folded bill and wrote beneath it, "Never again." Even Isla, still unsure if she'd have a job by the end of the week, walked into her supervisor's office with her head high. "I'm willing to go on record," she said, "and not just about what happened, about what's been happening for years." The supervisor didn't argue, because by then, the call had come. Not from PR, not from legal, from the office of Marva Ellington, requesting a full shareholder meeting with a new agenda and a very different seat at the table. The seat no one could take from her now. The morning of the shareholder meeting arrived not with thunder, but with a thick, purposeful stillness. Like the air before a storm knew to hold its breath. Aureus Skyline's glass and steel headquarters in Denver loomed tall against the overcast sky. Inside, security moved with silent efficiency. Press badges were checked twice, and hushed conversations passed between closed doors. But no one spoke Marva's name out loud. Not yet. They didn't have to. Everyone knew who was coming. In the boardroom on the top floor, the walls were lined with screens showing rolling headlines. Ellington set to address airline scandal. Largest stakeholder demands systemic change at Aureus. Seat 1, a sparks industry reckoning. Marva arrived just before noon. She didn't wear a power suit or bring a media entourage. Instead, she wore soft gray slacks, a navy blouse, and the same quiet poise that once let her walk into male-dominated boardrooms and speak numbers they couldn't ignore. Samantha walked beside her, calm but alert, carrying a single folder tucked neatly beneath her arm. No grand entrance, no cameras, just purpose. The room went quiet as Marva stepped in. Board members rose, some out of habit, others out of guilt. CEO Raymond Holt offered a polite nod. It was tight, calculated, the nod of a man preparing for a meeting he couldn't control. "Ms. Ellington," he said, "thank you for joining us." Marva returned the nod, taking her seat without waiting for invitation. "Let's begin." The first 10 minutes were procedural. Minutes approved. Agenda acknowledged. Legal counsel confirmed. Then came the pivot. "We're here today," Raymond said, "to address recent events that have drawn significant public attention. We understand emotions are high." Marva raised a hand, gently but firmly, cutting him off. "This isn't about emotions. This is about accountability." All eyes turned toward her. She stood slowly, opening the folder and pulling out a slim set of papers. "I have 3 proposals," she began, "and as your largest individual stakeholder, I'm formally requesting they be adopted immediately." The room tensed. First, every staff member involved in the incident aboard Flight 2839 is to be suspended pending full investigation, with permanent termination for those found to have acted in violation of conduct policy. No one spoke. Second, Aureus Skylines will partner with an independent ethics organization to create a mandatory anti-bias training program for every level of staff, from ground crew to executive leadership. She paused, made sure everyone was listening. And third, we will ground all domestic flights for 48 hours to launch this reform, not as punishment, but as acknowledgement. The CFO blinked. "Ground all flights?" Raymond sat forward, hands clasped tightly. "Marva, that's unprecedented." "So is what happened to me," she replied. A silence spread through the room, heavy, thick with discomfort. It was one thing to issue apologies. It was another to lose money over them. Marva let the quiet stretch just long enough to make them feel it. "I didn't come here to ask for a favor," she continued. "I came to remind you that equity isn't about marketing. It's about action, real, costly, inconvenient action." A junior board member, barely out of his 30s, shifted uncomfortably. "But a full shutdown? The media will tear us apart." Marva gave a small, wry smile. "They already are." Samantha placed a second document on the table, a full public statement, pre-drafted, co-signed by Marva and 3 other major shareholders. The title read, "Aureus Skylines will not fly until it can carry all people with dignity." It was clean, sharp, impossible to ignore. By the time the vote was called, the tension in the room had shifted from resistance to inevitability. No one wanted to be the last hand raised. The motion passed, all 3. Later that afternoon, Aureus Skylines made the announcement. Flights would pause, training would begin. An independent investigation was already underway. The headlines changed again. Airline grounds fleet amid ethics overhaul. Marva Ellington forces corporate reckoning without raising her voice. And at airports across the country, travelers paused at terminals to read signs that said, "We're not flying today. We're learning how to treat people better. Thank you for your patience." Some rolled their eyes. Some complained. But many nodded slowly, because somewhere deep down they understood. Not all landings happen on a runway. Some happen inside us. At precisely 4:30 p.m., Three individuals were summoned to a small conference room inside the Human Resources Wing of Arrayas Skyline's Denver headquarters. No name tags, no long table. Just three identical chairs set across from the HR director, two legal advisors, and a pair of silent security officers standing near the exit. Tessa Kincaid arrived first, her walk uncertain, hands tightly clutched around her phone like it could protect her. Grant Vessler came in next, trying to appear composed, shoulders squared, tie perfectly knotted, but the flicker in his eye betrayed something looser, something unraveling. Captain Roderick Hayes was last, his once authoritative stride now slightly slower, more mechanical than assured. No one greeted them, no small talk. The HR director, a middle-aged woman with glasses that never left the bridge of her nose, slid three envelopes across the table. Then she looked up, not with malice, not even frustration, but with the weary disappointment of someone who'd seen this coming long before anyone admitted it. "I'll be brief," she said. "Effective immediately, your employment with Arrayas Skylines is terminated." Tessa gasped. Grant stiffened. Hayes simply sat back in his chair, eyes closing for a moment longer than necessary. Tessa leaned forward, voice trembling. I was just doing my job. I followed the lead of my supervisor. I never meant—" "You accepted cash from a passenger during an active service window," the HR director interrupted, "and you ignored company policy regarding reassigned seating procedures on video, multiple angles." Grant's nostrils flared. "This is absurd. She made it a racial thing. We didn't even mention—" He was cut off by one of the legal advisors. "You used the phrase, 'We can do this the easy way or the hard way,' to a seated, compliant passenger who had already shown her ticket and ID. That's coercion, and it violates Section 4C of the passenger treatment protocol you signed during onboarding." Hayes raised his hand slowly. "I didn't witness the start of the incident. I deferred to my crew's judgment." The HR director turned her screen toward him. On it played a still image of the captain standing behind Grant as he threatened Marva with removal. Then another, Hayes listening in silence as Grant referred to Marva's presence as a disturbance. Then the final blow. Hayes himself using that very term to justify her ejection. "You didn't intervene," she said flatly, "not when your authority could have stopped everything." No one replied. Because what could they say? Security didn't move. There was no scene, no yelling, only a slow, almost ceremonial process of watching three careers collapse into a silence none of them had prepared for. "You'll be escorted out," the HR director continued. "You will receive 2 weeks severance. Your badges are deactivated." Grant stood abruptly. "That woman, Marva Ellington, she planned this. She was baiting us." The legal advisor finally spoke again. "She's the largest shareholder in the company. She didn't have to bait you. She simply had to be treated poorly. And wait." Tessa began crying, quiet, stifled sobs as she gathered her things. Hayes didn't cry. He didn't speak again at all. He just stood, nodded once, and walked toward the door. As they were escorted out, every head in the hallway turned. No one smiled. No one jeered. But they all watched the uniform walk of shame of people who had once controlled cabins, now unable to walk freely through a building they used to navigate with ease. Somewhere on the East Coast, Sloan Whitbridge opened her email to find a letter from her employer. Her firm, a high-profile investment consultancy, had placed her on indefinite leave. The letter was clinical, but its message was clear. She was now a liability. Her phone buzzed. Another unknown number. She didn't answer. She was no longer Sloan Whitbridge, esteemed executive. She was the woman from that video, the one who paid to have someone removed and smiled when it worked. Back at the hotel, Marva sat quietly in an armchair by the window sipping tea. The view showed a city in motion, cars passing, lights blinking, lives continuing. Samantha walked in holding a printed list. "They're gone," she said. "Tessa, Grant, Hayes, all terminated." Marva didn't smile, she just nodded. "They had a choice," she said. "They always did." She looked down into her teacup for a long moment. "This was never about revenge." Samantha lowered her voice. "Then what was it about?" Marva looked up, her eyes calm, steady. "Making sure the next woman in seat 1A doesn't have to prove she belongs there. In the weeks following the firings, Aureus Skylines underwent a metamorphosis that wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. The headlines faded from the top of the news cycle, but inside the airline, change was no longer optional. It was structural. Every employee, from the C-suite to the tarmac crew, was scheduled for a new mandatory training called Flight Forward. Designed in partnership with an outside equity firm, it wasn't just the usual slide deck and stage video. This was immersive, uncomfortable, reflective, because the company didn't just need compliance, it needed clarity. And just as she had promised, Marva wasn't sitting back. She personally attended several sessions, not as a speaker, not as a symbol, just present, listening, watching. Sometimes she sat in the front row, other times in the back, quiet, taking notes on a small legal pad. People noticed. They always noticed. In one session in Phoenix, a baggage handler named Lou stood up and said, "I've never seen a person at your level come down here. You don't gotta be here." Marva smiled gently. "Neither do you, but you are." Lou nodded once, then sat down with a new posture. In another session, a young gate agent confessed, "I used to assume our job was to keep things moving, keep passengers calm, especially the loud ones. But now I realize I only thought people were loud when they looked a certain way." A silence followed. It wasn't guilt that filled the room. It was recognition. Meanwhile, Isla Rayner had been quiet since the incident. She hadn't spoken to media, hadn't returned every message from other flight attendants who wanted her to speak on their behalf. But today she'd agreed to attend a roundtable meeting, one Marva had personally asked her to join. It took place in a modest, sunlit room at the Regional Training Center outside Chicago, a circle of 12 chairs. No podiums, no cameras. Marva entered with a thermos of tea and a manila envelope under one arm. She nodded at Isla as she sat. "Glad you came." Isla gave a small nod in return. "Still figuring out if I should have done more." Marva took a sip from her thermos. "You didn't stay silent. That matters." The session began. Employees spoke, shared. A pilot who admitted he'd stayed quiet too long. A gate supervisor who described watching bias and chalking it up to just how things go. Then Isla spoke. "I didn't say anything that day, not out loud, but I filmed it. I shared it. And I've lived with that decision every day since." She looked directly at Marva. "And I want to do more." Marva leaned forward, calm but pointed. "Then take your second chance." From her envelope, she pulled a printed offer letter. "I'm launching a new division within Aureus. Not just to monitor bias, but to re-engineer culture. We're calling it Skybound Equity. I want people on the team who've been on the inside, who've made mistakes, who've stayed quiet and decided not to anymore." She slid the letter across the table. Isla stared at it. She didn't reach for it right away. "I'm not perfect," she whispered. "Neither is the system," Marva replied. "But it's finally ready for people who want to make it better." That night, Isla called her mother, told her everything, and for the first time in weeks, she slept without dreaming of gate announcements and folded bills. Back at Aureus headquarters, CEO Raymond Holt sat in his office with the new quarterly report spread before him. Stock prices had stabilized. Passenger satisfaction was up, especially among demographics the airline had long struggled to serve with dignity. Press coverage was fair, even admiring. But the most surprising shift, job applications had increased, not because the company had regained its polish, but because it had finally shown its willingness to strip away the old paint and rebuild. A knock on his door broke the quiet. It was Marva. She entered without ceremony and sat down across from him. "I'm not here to gloat," she said. "I'm here to check progress." Raymond nodded, lips tight. "You've held us to a higher standard than we ever thought to hold ourselves." Marva folded her hands on the table. "Good, because this was never about punishing people." She paused, then added, "It's about giving them the chance to rise." From that day forward, every new employee orientation at Aureus Skylines opened with a simple story. Not about a scandal, but about a seat, one that was taken, then reclaimed, and in the process, turned into a platform that would lift everyone a little higher. Fall arrived in Denver the way it always did, quietly at first, then all at once. The trees outside Aureus Skylines headquarters began to burn gold and orange. their leaves twisting gently in the wind, like old truths finally letting go. Inside a newly renovated training auditorium, employees from every department filed into rows of chairs, clipboards in hand, a light buzz of conversation between them. They weren't here for a lecture or a press event. They were here for something different, the final session of the Flight Forward initiative. At the front of the room stood a new panel, former flight attendants, former crew leads, and yes, former critics of the airline. But at the center sat a name most had never expected to see in that chair again. Grant Vessler. His once crisp uniform was long gone. In its place, a simple gray button-down, sleeves rolled up, posture humble. His hands were clasped tightly together on the table in front of him. He didn't look broken. He looked changed. The room quieted as the moderator introduced the panel and passed the mic to Grant. He stood, took a deep breath. "I used to think I understood what bias was," he said. "I used to believe that because I didn't use certain words or didn't act out of malice, that meant I wasn't part of the problem." He looked across the audience. But bias doesn't always look like hatred. Sometimes it looks like policy, like a glance, like asking one passenger to move, just because it's easier than explaining to the other one why they're not entitled to anything. He paused, voice steady. "That day on the plane, I thought I was just keeping the cabin calm, keeping things moving, but what I was really doing was making someone invisible." A few heads nodded, others sat very still. Grant cleared his throat. "I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not owed that. But I am choosing to spend the rest of my career working so no one else has to be removed for being in a seat they earned." From the back row, a woman in an Aureus polo raised her hand. "What made you decide to come back?" she asked. Grant didn't blink. "Getting fired made me angry," he said. "But watching that video again, hearing my voice, that made me ashamed." He looked toward the side door, where a familiar figure had quietly entered. Marva. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence was its own kind of wind. Not violent, but strong enough to steer. When the session ended, people lined up, not to criticize, but to ask questions, to talk, to share. And Grant stayed. He answered everyone. Outside in the corridor, Marva waited. When Grant finally stepped through the doors, he paused in front of her. "I never thanked you," he said, "for giving me a second chance." Marva tilted her head, considering. "Not everyone takes it." He nodded, his eyes softer than they'd ever been on the job. "I almost didn't." She smiled just a little. "Almost doesn't get you through turbulence." He chuckled quietly. "You ever think we'll fly clear again?" Marva didn't answer right away. She looked out a nearby window where a jet lifted off in the distance, slicing upward into the gray autumn sky. "Only if we're willing to face the wind," she said. And with that, she walked away. No grand exit, no applause. Just the quiet sound of someone who had already moved on to the next gate. Because the work wasn't finished, not yet. The legacy press called it the Marva effect. Industry blogs called it the seat won a shift. But inside the hearts of those who'd lived through it, those who'd watched it unfold in real time, it was something much simpler. It was a reckoning. 6 months after the day Marva Ellington was escorted off Flight 2839, Aureus Skylines was no longer the same airline. Not by branding, not by policy, and certainly not by culture. Passenger complaints had dropped 37% in key markets. Employee satisfaction had risen to its highest point in a decade. But more than the numbers, something else had changed. Something that didn't fit neatly into a spreadsheet. People were watching each other differently, more carefully, with less assumption, with more curiosity, and yes, with discomfort sometimes, but also with a growing understanding that dignity didn't come with a price tag or a class of service. It came with being seen. That morning at Chicago Midfield International, Marva stood once again in front of Gate B12. Same gate, different flight. Her granddaughter was turning 7 that weekend, and she'd promised to be there this time before the candles were lit. She wore a soft blue coat, a simple carry-on at her side, and a scarf wrapped neatly around her shoulders. The attendant at the desk looked up, eyes wide. "Ms. Ellington, we've pre-boarded your seat. Would you like an escort?" Marva smiled kindly. "No need, sweetheart. I know the way." As she stepped onto the plane, several heads turned, not out of curiosity, but out of quiet recognition. Some passengers nodded politely. One woman mouthed, "Thank you." Marva didn't make a scene. She just found her seat, 1A, placed her bag beneath the seat in front of her, buckled in, and exhaled. Across the aisle, a younger black woman sat with a sleeping toddler in her arms. She looked exhausted but content. Their eyes met, and the woman offered a smile. "I've read about you," she whispered. Marva chuckled softly. "That's not always a good thing." "No," the woman said, shaking her head. "This time, it is." The intercom buzzed to life, and the pilot welcomed passengers with the usual script. But then, just as he signed off, he added something new. "We're proud to be part of an airline that believes every seat matters because every person does." A small round of applause broke out from the back of the plane. Someone up front clapped once, then stopped, because this wasn't a moment for noise. It was a moment for stillness. Outside the window, the ground crew gave a wave. The plane began to taxi. Marva looked ahead, eyes fixed not on the aisle or the attendants, but on the quiet horizon rising up to meet them. Seat 1A didn't come with any more legroom than it had 6 months ago, but it came with history now, and weight, and hope, and for the first time in a long while, it also came with peace. In the weeks that followed Marva's return to the skies, her story, though no longer plastered on every news site, had not faded. Instead, it had settled into something more lasting. It had become part of how people talked about flying, about fairness, about what happens when you stop asking politely for respect and start building systems that guarantee it. Inside a quiet meeting room at the Aureus Skylines main training center in Atlanta, a small plaque was mounted beside the entrance. The Ellington Room, dedicated to those who refused to give up their seat, on the plane or in life. It didn't take up much space, no fanfare, no ribbon cutting, but every new hire saw it, and every employee who entered that room for their ethics and inclusion training would now know exactly who Marva was. Before the headlines, before the scandal, before Seat 1A became a movement. Across the city in a sunlit studio office above a small cafe, Grant Vessler sat in front of a camera, hands folded neatly in his lap. It wasn't a formal interview. It was something bigger. He had volunteered to be part of the Reframe Initiative, a new digital series created by Aureus in collaboration with community leaders to document the personal journeys of those directly impacted by systemic bias. When the director asked why he wanted to speak publicly, Grant didn't hesitate. "Because silence is easy," he said. "It lets you believe you're neutral. But silence is how we got here." The interviewer asked, "What does justice look like to you now?" Grant paused. "It used to mean consequences. Now, I think it means clarity, the kind that hurts, the kind that makes you want to fix things, not just for your sake, but for the next person walking down that same aisle." He took a deep breath, voice steady. "And I'm not proud of what I did that day, but I'm proud of what I decided to do afterward." A week later, that clip would circulate quietly among internal employee groups, not viral, not flashy, but real, and more importantly, human. Elsewhere, in a modest classroom at a community college on the south side of Chicago, Captain Roderick Hayes stood before a group of aviation students. No epaulets, no uniform. Just a button-down shirt and a stack of flight safety manuals he now used for instruction. He had taken a position as a guest instructor in aviation ethics, something he'd once considered beneath him. Now it was his redemption. "I didn't speak up when I should have," he told the class. "I deferred to rank, to routine. That was my failure." A young student raised his hand. "Do you think you should have lost your job?" Hayes nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "I do, because leadership without courage isn't leadership at all." The students were quiet for a beat longer than usual after that, but none of them looked away. Back at Aureus, the changes continued. Passenger care specialists were added to every long-haul flight, trained not just in hospitality, but in conflict de-escalation and inclusive service. Hiring practices were rewritten. Bonuses were tied not only to performance, but to peer reviews on fairness and respect. Marva received weekly updates on these reforms, not because she demanded them, but because the company had learned that transparency wasn't optional anymore. It was expected. One Friday afternoon, Samantha called with news. The last passenger survey just came in, she said, her voice laced with cautious optimism. We hit 92% satisfaction across all demographics. No drop-off, no caveats. Marva was quiet on the other end of the line. That's good, she finally said. You don't sound surprised, Samantha replied. I'm not, Marva said. Because when you stop asking people to shrink and start asking how to make more room, they show up every time. That evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sun melt behind the trees, Marva thought about the word justice again. She thought about how often it gets confused with punishment, how people think justice means someone else loses something. But she'd seen something else happen. She'd seen people lose what needed to be let go and gain what truly mattered. She took a sip of tea, warm and earthy. Justice, she realized, wasn't about reclaiming one seat. It was about making sure no one had to fight so hard for the next one. The leaves had mostly fallen by now. Marva stood on the tarmac of a small regional airport just outside of Greensboro, North Carolina. It wasn't a press stop. It wasn't a ceremony. She was here for something quieter and maybe more meaningful. Aureus Skylines had just launched a new route through a partnership with regional carriers to service overlooked cities, places often cut off from reliable air service due to profitability models. It was part of the company's new Equity and Access program, inspired directly by the wave of reform Marva had helped ignite. The first flight was boarding behind her, the engines humming gently like a prelude. A young agent, no older than 22, approached her with a laminated sign. Ms. Ellington, she said, holding it out with both hands, we thought you should do the honors. Marva looked down at the sign. It read, Flight 121A, Ellington Service Line, in honor of those who make room for others. She didn't cry, not exactly, but her throat tightened in that quiet, old ache that always came with being seen after a long time spent invisible. She walked to the base of the ramp, placed the sign beside the boarding door, and stepped back. That was enough. That evening, the news would run a short segment, just a few seconds of footage. Marva standing on the runway, the sign at her side, the plane taxiing into the dusky sky. The caption underneath, a flight with her name, but for everyone. Back home, she returned to her usual rhythm, reading, cooking, FaceTiming her granddaughter, and watching the world keep moving. Until one letter arrived. It came from a young man named Deshaun Whitmore, a first-generation pilot now in training for his first job with Aureus. He wrote, I almost gave up on aviation after what happened to you. I saw the video and thought, if someone like her can get removed, what chance do I have? But then I watched how you didn't just fight, you changed the whole flight plan. You didn't ask for a seat. You made one for all of us. I just wanted to say thank you. My first assigned flight will depart from gate B12. I hope I make you proud. Marva read the letter twice, then set it on the counter beside a cup of tea she hadn't touched. She looked out the window, same trees, same porch, but the world felt a little different now. And not because of fame, not because of headlines, because of ripple. Because somewhere out there, a young black pilot would walk down an airport corridor with his shoulders straight, and no one, no policy, no preference, no price tag would make him feel like he needed to shrink. Because justice, real justice, isn't just about what happens to the people who caused harm. It's about what opens up after. And that's what Marva had done. She didn't just reclaim a seat, she reset the cabin. And now, the rest of us, we're all on that flight. So what started with one woman refusing to give up her rightful seat became a movement that reshaped an entire company and reminded us all that real change doesn't come from yelling the loudest. It comes from standing your ground with quiet, undeniable dignity. What about you? Have you ever been made to feel like you didn't belong until you proved that you did? Drop your story in the comments. We read every single one. And if this story moved you, inspired you, or even made you think twice, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Because here we don't just tell stories, we uncover the truths that deserve to be heard. And trust me, the next one might just change how you see the world.